All right, everybody, good to see you tonight. It is, well, first of all, let me have you turn to the book of Daniel. It is good to be back in our study of Daniel tonight. Between the outreach and my surgery, we haven't been in Daniel for about a month. So good to be back. Last time we met, we started looking at chapter 11. Let me recap briefly. At that time, we said that Daniel chapters 10 to 12 together form one narrative dealing with one vision. This is the fourth vision that Daniel was given. And with each one he received, they get longer and a little more detailed. And chapter 11 was really a panoramic view of history, starting with the Persian Empire and running all the way through to the last world empire before Jesus returns, the Antichrist kingdom. And last time we started with chapter 11, verse 1, and got as far as verse 20. And for the most part, those verses dealt with the Grecian Empire. This is a little hot, guys, up here. For the most part, those verses dealt with the Grecian Empire, which defeated the Persians to become the next world governing empire. The Grecian Empire rose to dominance under the leadership of one of history's most famous and gifted military strategists, Alexander the Great. He began, as we've already seen, his military conquest in 334 BC, and he conquered the known world in 12 years. Amazing what he was able to accomplish. He died in 323 BC at the age of 32. The prophecy goes on in chapter 11, verse 4, when it says, "And when he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these." History records that when Alexander died, his kingdom was not inherited by his son or any of his relatives, but by his four generals. Now, that comes through here in verse 4, but more specifically, I think it was chapter 8, gets really into that and talks about it in great detail. But just as verse 4 predicted, and Gabriel is giving this vision to Daniel from the Lord God Almighty, of course, and is telling Daniel that this great leader, when he died, his kingdom would not be given to his son or his relatives. It would be split up among his generals. That's the idea here. And once again, these four generals were as follows: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus I, and Ptolemy I. Now, the rest of this prophecy focuses on two of the four generals that inherited land to the north and south of Israel. Seleucus, who ruled over Syria, and Ptolemy, who ruled over Egypt. The question is, well, why didn't God focus on all four generals? Why only these two? Well, because very simply, God is really only concerned about Israel in these prophecies. They're the focus. And so he's focusing on Israel and what affects his people, the Jews. Now, Seleucus to the north of the Syrians and Ptolemy to the south, or the Egyptians, became perennial enemies. But to get to each other, they had to march through Israel. Israel was the corridor. So every time they marched through Israel to get to each other, they dragged the Jewish people into their conflicts, is what happened. Subsequently, whichever of the two was victorious over the other, well, Israel fell under subjection to that nation. Now, as we've already pointed out, eventually Seleucus and Ptolemy became names for dynasties. The Seleucid dynasty to the north and the Ptolemaic dynasty to the south. And as we studied this last time we met, these two dynasties fought with each other for dominance for the next 118 years. As victory and power was transferred back and forth between them. But then in 175 BC, guys, a Syrian leader rose to power who became very important to biblical history. He was, without a doubt, one of the most wicked and ruthless leaders who has ever lived, especially when it came to the Jewish people. We're going to have you drop down to verse 21 now, is where we actually pick up the study for tonight. He was so bad that verse 21 actually calls him a vile person. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. His name was Antiochus IV. And Antiochus IV was the 8th king of the Seleucid dynasty, and he reigned from 175 to 164 BC. If you remember, he was the little horn that we read about in chapter 8. He is a type of the Antichrist, which is why he's referred to as a little horn in chapter 8, but is not the little horn of chapter 7, who is the Antichrist. All right? We talked about that when we were in chapter 7. But Antiochus was infamous. He was an infamous persecutor of the Jewish people. And he wanted them to submit to Greek culture and customs, and was more than willing to use violence and murder to accomplish that objective. He slaughtered thousands of Jewish men, and this is kind of review from previous studies, but he slaughtered thousands of Jewish men, sold many of their wives and children into slavery, and tried to completely obliterate the Jewish faith because he saw it as a real roadblock to the people becoming a secular society, Israel, jettison all this, Judaism and things. He wanted to, reculture them into the Greek culture ways. That's called Hellenization. Okay, whenever a group of people were indoctrinated into the Greek culture, its customs and ways and so on, it was called Hellenization. That's what Antiochus wanted to do. And again, his name was Antiochus IV, but he took for himself the name Epiphanes. Remember, we talked about this. Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means the manifest God. He saw himself as a God. No low self-esteem with this guy. All right? He saw himself as a God. He called himself Antiochus, the manifestation of God. Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, the Jews called him, and not to his face, of course, but they called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means Antiochus the madman. Okay? According to history, he had no legitimate claim to the throne. He replaced the previous Syrian king, who happened to be his brother, a man by the name of Seleucus Philopator. When Philopator died, he had 2 sons, Demetrius, who was the rightful heir to the throne, and then an infant son named Antiochus. But even though Antiochus IV wasn't in line for the throne, through the use of various intrigues and political maneuvering, he gained the throne. Listen, not by military force, but by cunning, exactly as the prophecy predicted, but also exactly as the Antichrist is going to rise to power. We know from our studies of Revelation, the Antichrist does not rise to power as a world leader now. He's going to be the leader of the final world empire before Christ comes to establish his kingdom on the earth. But the Antichrist is not going to come into power by force. He's going to be thrust into power by the people of this world, I believe, on the heels of, or in the aftermath of some kind of either a limited nuclear exchange on the earth, or some other catastrophe, whether it be something, a natural catastrophe. Some people believe that it could possibly be after some kind of an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. When you detonate a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere, it creates a pulse that completely fries all circuitry. It's not like you can even fix it. It has to be replaced. Okay? If Kim Jong-un detonated a couple of nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles in the atmosphere over the United States, he could throw us back into the 1800s instantly. Think about that. You'd have no electricity. You'd have no telephones, no means of communication. The grocery stores would be mobbed, and within a day or so, their shelves would be cleaned out. People would panic. And it would be a horrendous time. And in the midst of all this chaos, whatever it might be, nuclear war or something else, Many believe the Antichrist will rise to power. He'll have the wisdom of Satan. He'll be incarnated by the devil, or the incarnation of Satan. The devil will possess him, is what I'm saying. And he will have such charisma, such supernatural wisdom, and he will have supernatural powers, 2 Thessalonians 2 tells us, that the world will thrust this man into power thinking he is the world's Messiah. There are the three main religions on the face of the earth, Judaism, Islam, the Shia version, Iran and others, even like the New Age movement. These folks are looking for a Messiah. All of these groups, and that's the world is going to think the Antichrist initially is their Messiah. Even the Jews. Jesus said, "I came in my Father's name, you wouldn't receive me. Another will come in his own name, him you will receive." Talking about the Antichrist. And initially the Jewish people will also embrace him as their Messiah, but as we're going to see at the midpoint of the last 7 years, the tribulation period, he's going to do something that's going to cause the Jews to wake up. And they're going to realize he's not their Messiah at all. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. But he's not going to, Antiochus did not grab power in Syria by force. He used cunning, intrigue, and exactly how the Antichrist is going to come to power. Verse 22, "With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant." Now Antiochus was successful in battle against the Egyptians initially, which this verse describes him sweeping them away with the force of a flood. All right. The Egyptian king at that time was someone named Ptolemy. Ptolemy was a title, like Seleucus, okay? It's like Pharaoh, all right? That's a title. It means king, basically, ruler, all right? It's not a name. And the king of Egypt at this time was Ptolemy VI, whom Antiochus deceived and then defeated. One historian noted that, and I'm quoting, "It was Epiphanes' policy to throw his intended victims off guard by offering them his friendship and alliance. Then he would maneuver for an advantageous position till he could catch them by surprise," end quote, and defeat them, of course. This phrase, the Prince of the Covenant, seems to be a reference to the Jewish high priest whose name was Onias III. He was deposed by Antiochus, swept away, if you will, as the wording goes, in about 172 BC. You see, Onias opposed the Hellenization of Israel, and he supported he supported the Egyptian king over Antiochus. For these reasons, Antiochus had him murdered and put his brother, Onias' brother, Jason, in as high. Jason was very pro-Hellenization of Israel. That's why Antiochus liked him so much, but also he gave Antiochus a pretty sizable bribe to get the job. Okay, and so that's what happened, and Onias was out, murdered, and Jason, his brother, was placed in as high priest. The Jews, by the way, hated Jason. They felt he was a usurper. And this is going to come into play later on in this study, as we're going to see what he did at one point to try to ingratiate himself with the Jewish people, because he knew he wasn't in good terms with them. They knew he had bought the office of high priest. Onias was the true high priest, but he was murdered, and Jason put in his place. And so they really didn't have much love for him. All right, but verse 23, "And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. For he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people." Actually, Antiochus Epiphanes, if you study history, and we could spend weeks on the detailed history. It's amazing. I mean, but he was taken captive to Rome, and to make a long story short, he eventually escapes. When he comes back to Syria, he's a nobody. So he goes to the king of Pergamum and works out some kind of arrangement. The king, he was he could sell ice to an Eskimo, this Antiochus. I mean, he was just, he just had a way with words, and he would just win you over. And so he was able to convince the king of Pergamum to back him. And with a very few people, he was able to work his way and do his little thing. And eventually he became very powerful. Okay, as the prophecy says, became strong with a small number of people. As we just read, though, Antiochus often pretended friendship with his enemies to catch them kind of, off guard, to kind of disarm them, which is what he did with the king of Egypt. Now, it was made easier for him doing this with the king of Egypt because the king of Egypt was his nephew. He was the son of Antiochus' sister, Cleopatra, not the one you're thinking of, okay? The idea, though, is that we talked about last time how they tried to make an alliance. In those days, if you wanted to kind of make peace with a nation that you were always at war with, it was helpful to marry your son to the king's daughter up the other nation or vice versa. Have a marriage that would kind of, now all of a sudden you're family. You're not really enemies, you're family now. And that would work fairly well. And so Antiochus' sister was given to one of the kings of Egypt. And so the offspring that she had, one of her sons was Ptolemy the sixth. Ptolemy the sixth Philometor. Are you guys getting all this down? I don't see you writing. You're not going to do well in the test next week. So Ptolemy the sixth Philometor was Antiochus' nephew, the son of his sister Cleopatra. And Antiochus pretended to side with his nephew Philometor against another of his nephews, Ptolemy Euergetus, also known as Physcon, Ptolemy Physcon, who was actually Philometor's brother. And again, it was just a ruse. I mean, Antiochus was all about Antiochus. He really wasn't. He'd tell you that he wanted to make a treaty with you and he wanted to help you. It was all about him, though. This was a ruse. He told his nephew that, come on, we're going to make a treaty and I'm going to help you and so on. But it was all a ruse to advance his own interest. And soon after Antiochus seized the throne, his nephew Ptolemy Philometor made an ineffective attempt to recover the territory previously lost to Syria. So after they made a treaty, this young king, he was young, this Philometor. He was a young guy in his teens, okay, when he became the king. And Antiochus, being a sharp guy and able to really kind of, he convinced his young nephew that he was for him. But after they signed this treaty, he realized that Antiochus really wasn't for him. He was for himself. And so he tried to take back territory from his uncle that they had taken from Egypt. Well, his campaign, the campaign of Philometor, was a disaster. And his forces were swept away as by a flood, as the text states. Verse 24, he shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. This is interesting, because Antiochus Epiphanes greatly plundered the lands that he conquered. But unlike any other king before him, he gave much of the spoil to his followers, which cemented their loyalty to him while constantly adding to their numbers. I mean, if a follower of Antiochus was he loved to walk down the street and have his followers lining both sides of the street, just singing his praises and cheering him on while he threw gold and silver coins into the streets to watch them dive on these coins, fight each other. He'd laugh. He thought that was great. But they loved him because he gave them a lot of the spoil he won in battle. And so he was always surrounded by very loyal people. He bought his loyalty, you might say. And the idea behind the statement at the beginning of verse 24, he shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province. The province is, of course, a reference to Egypt. is a reference to his strategy of keeping a strong garrison of soldiers in Pelusium, which was a fortress on the border of Egypt. And the idea was he kept a very strong garrison of soldiers there at the border of Egypt so that every time he wanted to go down to Egypt, he could enter in without being opposed. He could enter in peaceably because nobody was going to mess with the soldiers down there. So he had access to Egypt anytime he wanted, and because he was basically controlling Egypt at that time. Verse 25, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portions of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So here's what happened. Again, Antiochus' sister Cleopatra had been the queen of Egypt since her husband died. Then when she died, her teenaged son, Ptolemy Philometor, as we just said, became king of Egypt. Well, he's a young king, and his advisors, I don't know, maybe, I'm sure they believed this, but they took advantage of his youth by convincing him that what they needed to do was gather a large army with the intention of trying to conquer Israel in southern Syria. Well, when Antiochus got wind of this little plan, he immediately organized his army and went down and defeated the Egyptian army and took his nephew Ptolemy Philometor captive. Let me read to you what one historian said about this, and I quote, he said, "Many of Ptolemy's woes resulted from the treachery of some of his own trusted advisors, who, as the text says, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portions of his delicacy shall destroy him." The author says Antiochus was a master of intrigue, and much of his success stemmed from his ability to plant a fifth column inside Egypt. He subverted Euryalus, okay, and Linnaeus, Ptolemy's guardians, and many other of the Egyptian king's courtiers and captains. The unhappy Ptolemy discovered too late that these men had been dealing treacherously with him throughout the course of the war, and that at the last they had openly betrayed him. Probably through their treachery, Ptolemy himself was delivered into the hands of his enemy. That would be his uncle, end quote. Verse 27. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. Antiochus' conquest of Egypt was incomplete in that he was unable to take Alexandria. In the meantime, because now he's got his nephew captive, but in the meantime, the Egyptians had grown tired of Philometor's ineffectiveness and gullibility as king. He's young, so he wasn't real wise yet. And so the people of Egypt, and especially those that were kind of in charge along with this young king, they grew tired of this teenage king. And so in his absence, they appointed Philometor's brother Physcon, also known as Euergetus, as the new king. They liked him because he was the only one that was able to kind of go against Antiochus in a particular battle and keep him from advancing. So they thought, this guy knows how to fight, and let's make him the new Ptolemy, the new pharaoh, basically. All right. But here's the thing. I think Antiochus was the first one to coin the phrase, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And so what happened was, now you got two brothers that are at odds. Okay, both of them the nephews of Antiochus, and he figures, hey, I see an opportunity to use one against the other to gain my objective, which is to completely conquer over Egypt. Okay, so he returns to Memphis in Egypt, Antiochus does, and sat down at the conference table with his young nephew Philometor, and he proposed an alliance with him. He pretended friendship with him, acknowledged him as Egypt's rightful king, promised to help establish him firmly on the throne. I'm going to help you out, kid. Just go with me. I'll help you out. I'll make sure you're established back on the throne firmly. And he even counseled with his nephew as to the best way to deal with the overthrow of his brother there in Alexandria. Well, no doubt Antiochus was the more shrewd of the two, but you know what? The apple doesn't fall far from the family tree, and Philometor was also playing his uncle against himself. I mean, both of these men sat at the same table, pretended to be friends, pretended to want to work together for each other's best interest, when all the while they were each lying to each other. And their goal was, of course, to defeat the other. Again, one historian explains what happened. I quote, "The youthful Egyptian king would try to persuade his uncle that if the invaders would leave Egypt, its people would rally around the legitimate king," that would be Philometor, "and he would then rule Egypt in friendly fashion and would give Antiochus whatever he might desire." What he was doing was saying, "Uncle, you've got all your troops stationed here, or this invading army. Now, if you pull your troops out, go back to Syria, the people will rally. See, they only chose my brother because he's a better warrior. Well, you got all your troops in the land of Egypt. This has caused them to want to have a warrior on the throne. But if you pull your troops out, go back to Syria, the people will rally around me as the rightful king. And once I gain power again, I'll give you whatever you want. I'll help you out in whatever way I can," right? The uncle would falsely declare that his only purpose was to secure the legitimate rights of his nephew. "I'm just here to help you, kid. That's all. That's my only interest." Thus the two kings would sit at the same table and lie to each other, just as the prophecy said. As predicted, the schemes of both men failed. Antiochus, thinking himself a master of strategy, put trust in the lying promises of his nephew and withdrew his forces from Egypt. As soon as he had done so, the nephew made peace with his brother, who was Ptolemy VII, Ptolemy Physcon, leaving Antiochus without any power in Egypt at all. Yet the plans of Ptolemy the Sixth also failed, for the supporters of Ptolemy VII did not give their full support to Ptolemy the Sixth. In other words, Philometor had been the king and went to battle. Antiochus, defeated him, captured him. So his brother Physcon was put on the throne. And so the idea was, well, uncle, get your troops out of here. The people will rally around me again as the rightful king. And so that's what Antiochus did, trusting his nephew. As soon as he pulled his troops out, Philometor and Physcon made up. They became, they made an alliance with each other. And but the people never really gave their full support back to the first king, Philometor. And so the supporters of Ptolemy VII, that would be Physcon, did not give their full support to Ptolemy VI, Philometor, but insisted that the two brothers reign as joint kings, thus leaving Egypt in a state of weakness, end quote. Just give you a little historical flavor of what's going on here, okay? The idea here that they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper. Listen, for the end will still be at the appointed time. That's Gabriel's way of saying that the leaders of this world can plan, they can connive all they want. God is still on the throne. God is still in control of human history. And you know what? I don't know about you, but I'm taking more and more comfort in that every day. As I see the foolishness and the corruption of man as leaders, I'm waiting for the day when Jesus comes to take control and establish a kingdom of righteousness on the earth. But it does give me a lot of peace and comfort to know that no matter what man plans, strategies, what he intends to do to gain power, God only lets man do what it's in the plans of God for God's purposes, okay? God is on the throne. Remember that. When our leaders make boneheaded decisions, God is still on the throne. He is in control of human history. And now, guys, listen, we actually move to the real crux of the matter. How Antiochus dealt with Israel, and how it foreshadows what the Antichrist will do to the Jewish people when he comes on the scene. Verse 28. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. The holy covenant is talking about the covenant that God made with Israel to give them the promised land, a land that Antiochus was usurping at this time, because he was really the dominant one, and whoever dominated the other kingdom, whether it was Syria dominating Egypt or vice versa, Israel fell under the control and dominance of that nation. But really, they were not a subject, they were a free people, they were God's people. But, of course, a guy like Antiochus cared not about the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them that land, right? Now, Antiochus' successful first campaign against Egypt in 169 BC is really the background for verse 28. And on his way back, now he has just defeated his nephew. This is it's about 170 BC. And he's on his way back to Syria. And as he's on his way back to Syria, he's going to march through Israel, as we said. So he stopped in Jerusalem with his heart set against the holy covenant of God's people, is what we just read. In his effort to Hellenize the Jewish people. Again, he's big on this. He wants to make Israel a secular nation. Sounds like some of our leaders. He wants to make Israel a secular nation, and there's no other culture that is as glorious as the Grecian culture. I mean, that's because he's actually, Antiochus' descendants at one time was one of Alexander's generals. Seleucus I was one of the guys that got territory of the Grecian Empire when Alexander died. So Antiochus traces his genealogy back to one of Alexander's four main generals. And the idea is that he wants to, there's nothing as glorious as Greek culture, language, religion, so on. Okay? So he wants to Hellenize Israel. And he stops there on his way back to Syria, and he declares their laws and customs no longer legitimate, and therefore they're now illegal, as he sought to bring them in line with Greek law and culture. So he gets back to Syria. But once he gets back to Syria, he is given word that his nephew has deceived him. His nephew has deceived him. How? Well, as Antiochus pulled his forces, his troops out of Egypt, the idea was that the people would rally around, Philometor. And Philometor, being loyal to Antiochus, they could have a nice alliance, help each other out. Well, when he gets back to Syria, word gets to him that Philometor and Physcon have reconciled. And now they're working together against Antiochus. He doesn't like that. So verse 29, at the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. The appointed time is once again a reference to God's timing. You see that, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son born of a virgin. Jesus, numerous times during his earthly ministry, my time has not yet come. Ecclesiastes 3, for every purpose there is for everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. We get the definite impression that God is working according to his own timetable. And when God says it's time for this or that to happen, that's what's going to happen. So at the appointed time, which was God's appointed time for Antiochus to act, that's what happened. Angry at being deceived by his nephew, after a couple years, he goes back down to Egypt. Now, the first time he went down there, he was victorious. He comes back with a lot of spoil and so on. But now his nephew has turned against him. And so a couple of years after that, in 168, he goes back down to Egypt to invade it again. But guys, this time the outcome, as the prophecy says, would be very different from his first campaign. Verse 30, For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Let me stop there. As he moves into Egypt, Antiochus, with his armies, he is opposed by the Romans who had come from Egypt in ships from Cyprus. As the Syrians were moving to besiege Alexandria, now they're in Egypt, but now they're about 4 miles from the city of Alexandria. That's what he wants. That's the place he couldn't conquer, Antiochus. He wants Alexandria, okay? And when they're about 4 miles from Alexandria, they are met by a Roman commanding officer named Gaius Popilius Laenas. He meets Antiochus, again, 4 miles outside the city, and he hands him a letter from the Roman Senate ordering him to leave Egypt or face war with Rome. You see, as we've already talked about this, Rome felt that if Antiochus was successful in conquering the Egyptians, the combined Syrian and Egyptian armies under Antiochus's control, well, they might pose a threat to Rome and its interests. So Rome wasn't taking any chances. They were already ascending. They were not the world power yet, but they were getting close. And they had a lot of power. And Gaius shows Antiochus this letter from the Roman Senate telling him, break off the attack, go back home. And Antiochus says to Gaius, give me a little time to think about it. Well, he really wanted some time to go back to Syria to, put together a larger army. Well, of course, this Roman general, this Gaius, knew full well what Antiochus had in mind. He was no fool. So Gaius took a stick, and he drew a circle around Antiochus in the sand. Here's what he said. You may take all the time you want to think about it, but you are not leaving this circle until you give me an answer, and there is only one answer that is acceptable. Well, guys, Antiochus had no choice but to submit to Rome's demands, for he knew that to resist was to declare war on Rome, and there's no way he was going to be able to do that. No way he was going to be able to take on Rome. This was a humiliating defeat, especially for a man who called himself the manifest God. Okay? I mean, a guy with an ego that big doesn't take defeat or humiliation too well. All right? So it was a humiliating defeat, but he had he had no choice. He had to obey the Roman order or risk going to war with Rome. Verse 30, therefore he shall be grieved, Antiochus, and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage, so he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Hold on to that thought, that last part, okay? Not only was Antiochus furious at having been humiliated in front of his men, to add insult to injury, on his way back to Syria, as he came to Jerusalem, he discovered that Jason the high priest has led an insurrection against Antiochus. Well, that was the last straw, okay? At that point, he turned his wrath fully against the Jewish people, and in fury he led 20,000 of his men against Jerusalem. He abolished the temple worship, killed the high priest, sacrificed a pig on the altar of sacrifice, and put an image of Zeus Olympus, the god he likened himself to, in the Holy of Holies. All this is referred to in verse 31. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, that would be the temple. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Well, before he did that, before he placed the abomination of desolation in the Holy of Holies, this statue of Zeus Olympus, the Jews, realizing what he was about to do, they were weeping and wailing, begging him not to put that abomination into the Holy of Holies. Not only did Antiochus refuse to listen to them, but he treated them brutally instead. One author said, and I quote, in his attack on Jerusalem, Antiochus IV is said to have killed 80,000 Jews, taken 40,000 more as prisoners, and sold another 40,000 as slaves. He also plundered the temple, robbing it of approximately $1 billion by modern calculations, end quote. Of course, this abomination of desolation rendered the temple desecrated and unusable for the worship of God. And guys, as we all know, this was a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist will do when he comes, even as Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24. If you turn there quickly. Now, Jesus is about to speak these words roughly 190 years, maybe close to 200 years after Antiochus. So obviously, he's not talking about Antiochus. Antiochus has been dead for, many years. We pick it up in verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Yeah, let him understand in this way that whatever happened in Daniel, not in Daniel's day, but in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, with Antiochus was only a foreshadowing of something that would happen just before Jesus would come back to the earth to establish his kingdom. Verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now we're going to talk more about the Antichrist next week. Let's continue. Daniel 11, verse 32. Gabriel continues with this prophecy. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Some of the Jews, apostate Jews, supported Antiochus in his attempts to Hellenize Israel. He used flattery and manipulation to bring them over to his side. Remember what it says at the last part of verse 30, so he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. These are apostate Jews that sided with Antiochus. All right? However, there was a godly group of Jews called Hasidim, who remained faithful to God and his laws and taught other Jews to do the same. It talks about there would be these faithful Jews who would do great exploits. Well, one who carried out great exploits, as we've already talked about in previous studies, was Judas Maccabeus. He was the son of a godly priest named Mattathias, who along with his brothers led a revolt that was later named the Maccabean Revolt. Verse 33, and those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. You know, tribulation has a way of purifying God's people. And God used Antiochus in part to separate the apostate Jews from the godly Jews. Okay? Well, not to get into it too deeply, but the idea was that this had a way of purifying and strengthening that which remained. It says here that to refine them, purify them, make them white, and so on. That was God's way of using the tribulation under Antiochus to kind of be a force to cleanse, to strengthen, purify the faithful. Okay? And many of these faithful Jews paid a heavy price. They laid down their lives for their city, their temple, and their faith by the thousands. But finally, after 3 years, Judas, nicknamed the Hammer, Maccabeus and his men won their independence by defeating the Syrians. You can read all about this, guys, in the apocryphal books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. As we've already talked about in previous studies, on December 25th, 165 BC, exactly 3 years after the temple was desecrated by Antiochus, it was rededicated. And the Jews celebrate this occasion annually as the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah. Their enemy, Antiochus Epiphanes, died in Persia in 163. He was judged insane at the time of his death, fulfilling the nickname the Jewish people gave him, Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the madman. And that's exactly what actually happened to him. He died insane. However, the freedom the Jewish people had won didn't last long, because not long afterward, Rome took control of the entire land of Israel. Well, Judas Maccabeus, though, brutally executed all of the apostate Jews that had sided with Antiochus. And so he was used to cleanse the nation of apostasy. He believed he was exercising the vengeance of Almighty God. Now, let me just say this to you. It could be for an Old Testament priest like Judas, given the circumstance and all that was going on, that God could have used him, and probably did use him as an instrument to destroy all the apostate Jews that had sided with Antiochus against the Holy Covenant and against God's true people. Well, I'm not saying that God didn't put his hand on Judas Maccabeus and use him as an instrument of vengeance to purify the land of these apostates, okay? I do know this. When it comes to us as Christians, we are not to take vengeance on our enemies. God said very clearly, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." Therefore, Paul said, if your enemy thirsts, give him something to drink. If he hungers, give him something to eat. Hopefully, by showing him kindness, you'll win him over to Christ. But the idea, guys, we can't force people to love and obey God. You can't do it. I mean, that's what false religious systems like Islam do. They tell people, convert, obey, or die. Well, you might be able to, and I'm sure they are able to control people to do what they want, but where's the heart, though? People will go through the motions to avoid being brutalized or even murdered, but where's the heart? See, God's all about the heart. You can't force people to love God from the heart. You can beat them into submission through persecution, but you can't force them to love God freely and to do for him out of a love for him, to obey him. You can't do that by force. I know that Judas Maccabeus had a lot of zeal. A lot of zeal. And religious zeal is the most powerful zeal of all. You know why? Because it's a kind of zeal that comes when a person believes they are fighting for good over evil, fighting in the name of their God to honor him and obey what he has said, whoever or whatever that God happens to be. Now, zeal for the cause of Christ is a good thing. But zeal for any other cause, that is the cause of any other false religious system or whatever, that's a bad thing. Okay? That's a bad thing. Gabriel ends this section of chapter 11 by telling Daniel that some of the events that God wanted revealed to Daniel about the future of his people wouldn't take place until, listen, the time of the end, verse 35. So some of this was going to take place way out into the future. Way out into the future. John Walvoord, one of my favorite commentators, said, and I quote, the amazingly detailed prophecies of the first 35 verses of this chapter, containing, as they do, approximately 135 prophetic statements. That's incredible. In 35 verses, the first 35 verses of chapter 11, you have roughly 135 fulfilled prophecies that have been fulfilled by the day in which we're living in. All right? Not all fulfilled, he said. They constitute an impressive introduction to the events that are yet future, beginning in verse 36. So beginning in verse 36, the prophecies are given that are yet future to us. All right? Walvoord said, the fact is that there is no supported evidence which can contradict any statements made in these 35 verses. From the divine viewpoint, the accuracy of this prophetic word is supporting evidence that prophecy yet fulfilled will have the same precise fulfillment in the future, end quote. What is Walvoord saying? He's saying, look, If God has fulfilled everything he said, not just in chapter 11, but we're talking about the Word of God in general, all the prophecies, if all the prophecies that God has predicted, and there's been hundreds that have been fulfilled since, Christ, well, even back in the Old Testament. If God has fulfilled so many prophecies up until this point with amazing accuracy and consistency, what makes anybody think that whatever is left in the way of future prophecies is not going to be fulfilled with the same dynamic, fulfillment? This is what he is saying. Now, having mentioned the time of the end, guys, Gabriel will now speak about the future Antichrist and what the Bible calls the terrible time of Jacob's trouble in verses 36 through verse 1 of chapter 12. I'm going to leave you tonight with something Pastor David Jeremiah shared in his commentary on the book of Daniel. I'll read it to you. We'll close. He said, if we believe that God is able to create the world, then it seems to me if he wanted to accurately prophesy a little section of history to give us insight into his prophetic mind, then he certainly is capable of doing that. I've had people say to me, Pastor Jeremiah, I've got to be honest with you, I don't believe all this stuff, all these predictions. Jeremiah said, well, the story is told about a man out on Long Island who for years dreamed of owning a very special barometer. This is when barometers had just been invented, and he always longed to own one for himself. He finally saw one in a mail-order catalog and ordered it. When he unpacked the instrument, he was dismayed that the needle on the brand new barometer was set and seemed to be stuck, pointing to the section marked hurricane. He took it out of the box and shook it for all it was worth, but he couldn't get it to work right. He wrote a scorching letter to the catalog house and mailed his protest while he was on his way to the office in New York the next morning. That evening, when he got back to Long Island, he found that not only was his barometer missing, but so was his house. The barometer had been right. A hurricane had been predicted, and a hurricane had come. Jeremiah says, we have seen the accurate fulfillment of prophecies through Daniel. Now we move up to the stage in history where the prophecies are for a time yet in the future. Whether we believe them or not, what God has said will come to pass. Are you ready? End quote. And we'll get into future prophecies, God willing, next week. Father, we thank you, Lord, for your word. Your word is truth. And Lord, you have said you are going to tell us things before they happen, that when they do happen, we will know that you are God, and this is your word. Because nobody knows the future like you do, and nobody can predict the future and be right every single time as you. So, Lord, prophecy is one of the stamps of authenticity that you have placed in your word to confirm that it is indeed the word, not the word of man, but the word of God. And so, Lord, as we read your word, give us grace to revere what you have said, because it will come to pass. We don't know how. It may look like the odds are so stacked against it coming to pass that how could it even be fulfilled? But Lord, you have shown us time and time again in the pages of history. And when you've prophesied something, no matter how far-fetched it may have seemed at that moment, Lord, your word has always come to pass faithfully. So, Lord, give us grace as we continue in this study, that you would bless it and use it for your glory in Jesus' precious name. Amen.